Reclaim is a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter, with your host, Thais Sky. Together, we will explore the questions of what does it look like to reclaim our sovereignty, our worthiness, our voices as women in this messy world. No topics are barred as we offer roundtable discussions on life, spirituality, politics, and what it means to be a woman in the modern age. Let's do this. Hello, everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm in my recording studio. And by recording studio, I mean my closet, because Reclaim is a homegrown production that I do. I produce, I write, I do all of the work of bringing on the guests. I mean, this is my passion project and I am obsessed. So thank you to all of you who have supported the podcast through Patreon. Patreon is a platform of choice for those of you who are enjoying the conversations that I'm having. Patreon is a great way for you to donate as little as $1 a month to making this podcast sustainable in my life and in the world. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I've also gotten some PayPal donations, which is it's a very beautiful, pleasant surprise when I get a little email that somebody has donated money directly through PayPal for the podcast. It makes my heart sing that you all are getting so much value from this work. So thank you. This week I have Heather Plett for an interview. We're going to talk about holding space. What does that mean to hold space for ourselves? What does it mean to hold space for others? What does it mean to hold space during grief and trauma? What does it mean to hold space in complex conversations like social racial justice? These are some of the things that Heather and I explore. But before I bring Heather on, something that I've been thinking a lot about is entitlement and consumption. There's a lot of conversations out there about conscious consumerism, being cognizant of where your money is going. Is your money going to fund big banks? Is your money funding big organizations that are, pillaging the earth of resources? Where is your money going? And there's merit to that conversation, but that's not what I want to get into in this particular thought process that I'm having, but more about the ways in which capitalism and our society kind of perpetuates this idea that we're entitled to consume things without really being aware of what we're consuming. Here's how this thought process came about. Last night, I was thinking about when I was younger, in middle school and high school, and I would use a program called LimeWire. Does anyone remember LimeWire? LimeWire was one of the first apps that you could use on your computer, program that you could use to download music illegally through like torrents and whatever. And I became an expert at LimeWire because I wanted to consume these songs for free. Look how great this program allows me to get any song that I want without paying for it, without going to Barnes & Nobles or Borders, without buying the CD or the cassette tape. I could just go on my computer, find the song somewhere in the world, and download it. And this kind of mentality, I think, permeates through the millennial life, where we kind of feel entitled to consume whatever it is that we want for free, without really putting much thought into the cost. What is that costing? Particularly when we're talking about people's livelihoods. When we demand that other people give us stuff for free, when doing so directly impacts their life and their well-being. For example, I'm talking about maybe it doesn't hurt so much to download a free, Justin Timberlake song because he makes millions. But when we're talking about like a small indie record, or we're talking about lesser known people that they're putting their whole money, their whole everything into their music, into their creative arts, what are we really doing when we get that song for free? This doesn't apply just for the music industry, right? It applies everywhere. It applies in the service industry. We feel this sense of entitlement of we're paying for our food, and so it should be given to us in a very specific manner. And we don't even really acknowledge or look at the service people who are serving us. Look at the ways that we treat photography, like online. We have no problem stealing other people's photos that they've worked to capture and then putting it on their Instagram as if it's their own. I am guilty of that. I would go to a website like Unsplash. That's where I get my photos. And I use them all over my website. I use them all over my Instagram without even thinking twice about the effort that it took for somebody to capture that photo. All I care about is, I get it for free. I don't have to worry about copyright infringement. Boom, steal it, use it. Well, not steal it because they're giving credit, but you know what I mean, or giving permission. Download it, put it on my shit. Boom, done. Don't even have to think about it twice. How many times do we consume podcasts without thinking about the effort that it takes to produce it, to make it, when it's not backed by advertisers, when it's not backed by a huge company? So I've been thinking about this a lot because I think we kind of live in a culture that perpetuates this unconscious consumerism. Of course it does, because when you're unconscious of it, you consume more. But it's leading us to be very transactional in our relationships. It's leading us to be very transactional in our approach to consuming information, without really understanding what that consequence is, without really thinking about the person at the other end of the screen who spent hours writing that blog post that you just so carefully or so nonchalantly perused in an effort to find something that is worthy for you. Right? Like, how can we move from this transactional space of consumerism to a more relational space of consumerism? This is why I love Patreon, because Patreon allows me to support artists and people's whose work is so important, but outside of a platform like Patreon, they would just be something else for people to consume. I don't know about you, but I'm not in the space anymore of wanting to consume other people. I don't like being consumed. Right? Like, how often do we sign up for people's newsletters and we take in their work avidly, but the minute they sell us something because they need to in order to sustain their business that allows them to send you free shit, you unsubscribe because fuck that shit. Like, they're always promoting, right? So I don't know. This is just something that I've been thinking about. I don't have an opinion really, just more of inquiry as to where has our entitlement gotten to the place where we look at other people strictly from the perspective of what can they get me for free, ideally, versus really being in that relational space of witnessing other people's work and putting money where our mouth is, putting the money that is possible for us. Some of us is not possible. And that's why things are free, right? Think about it. I make this podcast free. I could not. Right? But I make it free because I want this to be a free resource for people. I want this to be available no matter where you are on the economic line, right? But if you're in a higher economic line, if you're higher up and you like what you're hearing, why wouldn't you support something so that it can continue to be free for people? Now, I speak of this about my podcast, but it could be about anything. It could really be about anything. Where are you holding back your ability to really be in relation to other people? Because somewhere you've internalized this idea that you're entitled to information. You're entitled to people. Yeah? So, enough about me rambling. Let me bring Heather on. But first, her bio. Heather is a facilitator, teacher, and writer who works with groups and individuals locally and internationally. Her specialty lies in the art of holding space, offering people deep listening and intentional support that will allow them to find their own way forward. She hosts meaningful conversations and uses creative methods such as group storytelling and art making to engage people in growth and healing. She's a skilled practitioner of the Circle Way and the art of hosting, and is the founder of the Holding Space Coach Facilitator program. She lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, with her 3 daughters. And of course, you can learn more about Heather at heatherplett.com. You can also go to my show notes, and you will find all of the links for her. So while you're listening to this conversation with Heather on holding space, I want you to think about your own capacity to hold space for what's uncomfortable within you, but also what's uncomfortable outside of you. Where do you hold back from conflict, hold back from speaking your truth because you're afraid of being uncomfortable, or you feel like you can't hold space for the other person's experience? Where do you push away your own pain because it's so hard for you to hold space for that? And where can you find a little bit of grace for exactly where you are? Hello, hello, Heather. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I really resonate with your words and your energy and your conversations on holding space and the ways that you talk about these topics. The idea of holding space is nothing new, and yet you have a way of talking about it and holding space for holding space that I think is really beautiful and very impactful for me. So I just want to take a moment and thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's go right in. Let's talk about holding space. Well, actually, why don't you share a little bit about yourself to people who may not necessarily know about you and your work, and then let's go into what does holding space mean for you?
Sure. So I am a writer, speaker, facilitator, coach. I don't do as much one-on-one coaching anymore, but it's still a little part of my identity. And focusing, especially, I think my real juiciness is around facilitation, being in group spaces and holding complexity, holding people in really deep and intentional conversations. And so that's my work. And it's really, in the last 3 years especially, has really become fine-tuned in helping people understand and learn to hold space, how to understand that concept, and how to understand that concept with depth and not with this kind of shallow social media version of thoughts and prayers. That's not what I'm talking about with holding space. We go really deep in this exploration, and that's what that's really what I see my work about, is about claiming the depth of this concept and inviting people to dare to go into that kind of more dangerous spaces of holding space.
Yeah. So what does that look like? Like what does holding space look like for you?
It first emerged, I've been a facilitator and I'm a practitioner of a couple of practices called The Art of Hosting Meaningful Conversations and The Circle Way. So these are global networks of people that are practicing holding meaningful conversations and creating containers for conversations. And so that was my learning process in the early years of this work, and really wrestling with how do we create a container for intentional conversations, but also for grief, for trauma, for complexity, for like hard race conversations, etc. That was my kind of learning journey. And then when it really solidified for me, because I'd been sitting with this concept of holding space for a long time, when it really kind of came together was when my mom died, and my siblings and I sat with her for 4 days in her dying process, and there was a palliative care nurse. She died at home, and we cared for her at home, and there was a palliative care nurse that would come and support her and do some of the hard things for us that we couldn't do or didn't know how to do, and she just had this incredible capacity for showing up with what was needed and not more, and not taking our autonomy away, not directing us or trying to control the outcome or anything. It was just about creating a container so we could do this really hard work of supporting our mom and be in that journey with her. So I sat with that for a couple of years, and then eventually wrote this blog post about how, for me, holding space was defined by what this nurse did for us, so that we could then in turn hold space for mom. And that blog post went crazy viral and still continues to float around the ether, because there's something about it that just connects with people all over the world in terms of having an understanding, because people throw that term around a lot, but a lot of people didn't really have the depth of understanding that post offered. So some of my work I see as being about giving people language for what they already intuitively know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when I meet with a new client and we're in the first phase of our work together where we're still getting to know each other, I often receive the feedback of, I'm so surprised that you don't try to change how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That I'm able to share how I feel and you simply validate that. And
Right.
I'm so accustomed to being in relationships where if I share how I feel, the propensity is, whether it's parent to child, right, or friend to friend, is it's going to be okay. Oh, you don't have to feel that way. Or
Yeah.
it's, move on, forget about it, forgive, right?
Yeah.
And all
Yeah.
of the ways that actually invalidates a
Yeah.
person's experience, especially particularly around grief and trauma.
Yeah. One of what I've really come to realize, and that's because like as I was simultaneously as I was doing this, understanding of grief and holding space for grief and trauma, I'm also very much a person who is passionate about racial justice, about
Mm.
having hard racial conversations, etc. And what I started to realize is how these two things are really married, and how when we don't hold space, the opposite of holding space, I've actually come up with this term, emotional colonization.
Ooh.
Because I think, and this is such a growing awareness for me, that because we have been raised and socially conditioned in colonialism, all of us have been impacted. Either we're among the dominant culture, or we're among the oppressed, or we're somewhere in between at the intersections. And all of us have been conditioned to accept colonization and accept a colonial kind of way of approaching things. So we colonize each other in our relationships all the time. If I'm not comfortable with your emotions, if they impact me, if they make me feel threatened in some way or unsafe in some way, I'm going to try to fix them for you, or I'm going to try to, redirect them, et cetera, et cetera. And it's largely because that's what we've been conditioned to accept is the way we should be in relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so heartbreaking because it prevents people truly showing up and being witnessed in who they are. And that reflection can be so critical to our healing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so I've just recently wrote a post about how, if we really want to hold space for each other, what we need to do is learn to understand our own sovereignty. So if I can accept, and if I can do my own personal work to accept that I am a sovereign person, and I am fully capable of making my own choices, I'm fully capable of owning my own body and deciding what boundaries I need, what kind of support I need, etc. If I can be sovereign, then I can also accept you as sovereign, and I don't need to shape you anymore. I don't need to change you. I don't need, I don't need you to be different, because
Mm.
I am, trusting in your sovereignty.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that development of sovereignty. What do you feel is a great place to begin with that?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it has to start with an awareness of. I wrote a post a few years ago, kind of sort of a pseudo poem about waking up is hard to do. It's called, and it's about the process of first, and it was written particularly for white women, because I am a white woman. That's my context. I wrote the process of understanding. First, you kind of wake up to your own oppression, and you start to realize, oh, wait a second, I'm being held back. There, all these microaggressions are happening, et cetera, et cetera. You become angry, and then you go through the process of how do I learn to trust myself, accept myself, despite how I'm being treated culturally, et cetera. But then you also have to start to wake up to the way you are oppressor, how both oppressed and oppressor lives within you. And
Mm.
then you have to do this even harder waking up of recognizing, oh, wait a second, what's being done to me, I'm also doing to other people. So my sovereignty is being taken away. So I'm starting to take it away from other people. And we get into this, ugly mix of our woundedness turns into the way we wound other people.
Yeah.
And so I think, I can't say what step one, step two, step three is on this journey, but I think it has to come with that whole growing awareness of both your oppression and your oppressor in you, and how how you heal both of those and how you release that and do that kind of, really intentional quest for yourself.
Yeah, I'm currently on your Facebook page scrolling like mad because I want to find the the thing that you wrote that was so divine, and I'm gonna find it there and I'm gonna read it. And it was about navigating your daughter and holding space for your daughter in the midst of her experience and not making it be about you. And I
Mhm.
feel like so I want to bring some context when we're talking about holding space while your background is in facilitating groups. This is an intimate relational concept of
Mhm.
being with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I say about that, because I teach a 6-month program on holding space, and what I often say to people is that the level of fear in holding space for somebody is awfully directly correlates with the level of risk in that relationship. So
Mm,
if I'm in an intimate relationship, like I can go to a place where I'm an outside consultant and I can hold space for people and then I can walk away. And if they don't accept it or they judge me or they don't, et cetera, it's not a high level of risk because I can walk away and I'm not involved in an intimate relationship there. However, when it comes to holding space in greater intimacy with my daughter, with my family, with my siblings, with my closest friends, there's a much higher risk there. So I'm going to bring a lot more of my baggage there because if they decide they don't like the way I'm doing this, if they don't like me, if they judge me, I have to live with that in a much more intimate way, and it's going to affect me on a day-to-day basis. So, as much as I love uh, holding space in group process, and I absolutely love hosting retreats, my learning edges are almost always in the intimate relationships in my own family with my kids, etc.
yeah. So I'm hearing that holding space is so much about vulnerability and
Mm-hmm.
being willing to be vulnerable with both the uncomfortable emotions that that person is experiencing and the uncomfortable emotions that are rising within us.
Yeah, it is vulnerability, but I often offer a bit of a caveat with that
Mm,
because it's vulnerability in how we show up and willing to be changed by the conversation, willing to be open and honest, etc. But if we are the one creating a container for somebody else, we also have to be prepared to withhold some of our vulnerability so that we can be more present for them. So there's that balance, and I call it compassion with detachment. There's that balance where I am not going to be so vulnerable that I'm going to center myself in this narrative. And
mm,
so if I'm holding space for somebody who's been traumatized, for example, if I start sharing all my personal stories of trauma because I want to be vulnerable, well, then I'm walking all over their current narrative. And so it has to be a balance. And I think some people think, oh, vulnerability is the way to do this, but it has to be vulnerability with the capacity to know when that needs to show up and when you need to simply, hold your tears for another day when you can be vulnerable with, with other friends who aren't in crisis at that
yeah.
time, etc.
Yeah. I hear that. Well, I found the post. May I please read it?
Yes, certainly.
Okay. So you wrote, when my husband and I separated and he moved out of the house, my youngest daughter was 13 and she was understandably angry about a situation in which she had no agency to control the outcome. I tried to be present for her in a kind and compassionate way that I knew how, while still wrestling with the healing work I also needed to do for myself. It was hard for both of us. I made mistakes. Finally, after weeks of very little communication between us, I said to her, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. And I want you to know that I'm prepared to hold your anger. Go ahead, scream at me if you must. Do what you need to do and know that I will not leave. And I will not throw the anger back at you. I will just hold it for you. In that situation, I had to recognize that as the person with more agency and power who had contributed to a situation that impacted her, I had to be prepared to receive what would come my way, even if I didn't entirely deserve it, even if it hurt, even if it scared me. I had to be prepared to hold it and not walk away. You wrote that in all caps, and it was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
This too is what it means to hold space, to create a container that is strong enough to hold rage, grief, fear, pain, etc. We receive what's ours, heal it, make reparations, and let the rest go, and we don't walk away. We take care of ourselves, but we don't walk away. Let's extrapolate that situation to other situations where there's an imbalance of power and agency. Take, for example, some of the conversations I've seen and been part of, both online and off, where there's an understandable anger on the part of the disenfranchised/marginalized people whose lives are being irrevocably altered by people with more agency and power. Online, I've seen it in response to a spiritual teacher who failed to listen when people challenged her to see her blind spots. Offline, I've heard it in response to the Colton Bushi and Tina Fontaine murder trials. For those of us with more power and agency, whether given to us as a birthright because of our skin color, gender, etc., or because we found ourselves in a hierarchically elevated position, can we hold this outrage and pain without walking away? Can we be strong enough to stay in the conversations even if it hurts, even if it scares us, even if we don't entirely deserve it? Can we receive what's ours, heal it, and let the rest go? This, to me, is what reconciliation looks like. Holding space, owning what's ours, listening deeply, making reparations, and not walking away. The good news is that my daughter and I weathered that storm and have a deeper relationship now because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Whew! I read that, tears coming down my face, because I think you speak so potently to both the interrelational conversation as well as larger context of race and gender and power and what it means to be a human in this world.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, there's so much talk these days about white fragility, for example, about how, people are running away from the hard conversations because they're being triggered. White fragility is showing up. And what I keep encouraging them to consider is, yes, I know that's going to hurt. When somebody shows up and they're really angry because you've had more benefits, you've had more privilege than them, that's going to feel painful. It's going to feel like an attack. It's going to feel like I don't deserve this, etc. And the fact of the matter is that if we want to be part of a different world, if we want to show up with love and compassion, and if we want to, shift some of these imbalances, we simply have to show up, and we have to let these things be in the container. And that's one of the reasons I teach a lot. Anything I teach in person and in groups, we do it in a process called the circle way, because the circle way is a way of holding stuff that not everybody shares. It's like we create a bowl. I'd say, the circle that we're in creates this container to hold that complexity, so no one person's going to have it thrown at them across the room. It's not going to be on my shoulders because I'm the white person in the room. I don't have to walk away with this, resting on me. I'm going to let you share it, and I'm going to let it show up in the room, but I don't need to take it on and become traumatized by it, etc. I'm simply going to create the space and create the container where we can hold that kind of anger and etc. Because that's part of their process of healing. And I can't tell you, don't be so angry, tone policing, all that stuff, because I have no right to be. I have no right to change your emotional reaction to something, to a situation, just as I didn't with my daughter. I mean, she had every right. It was a difficult situation as a 13-year-old to walk through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious about that complexity and how you hold space for complexity, particularly when our minds want to simplify and, compartmentalize and intellectualize and put everything in these narrow scopes of our understanding. How do we hold that space?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where I do, in my 6-month program, I spend a whole month talking about holding space for ourselves. And I think this is some of the most crucial work, that we can't show up to do this work until we have learned to become really good at holding space for our own stuff and healing it and releasing it, and doing whatever self-care practices, body work of releasing it, etc. But also being self-reflective and recognizing these are my blind spots. And you know what? It hurts like hell to have somebody point them out to me. But that doesn't mean that they're not wrong, that they're wrong. They may truly be things I have to identify. So that holding space for yourself, when it gets to that module in the course, it's not infrequent for somebody to say, I really don't like you right now, because they read my stuff and it's like, this is really hard stuff to work
Yeah.
through. And I say, I know, I'm not teaching this to be liked. I'm teaching this to prepare us to be better at holding space for this. And that's hard work. And that's hard to show up and to own my own stuff, to own my own, like I say, owning the oppressor and the oppressed in me, and integrating it all. Like I don't believe in compartmentalizing. I'm much more in favor of integrating and weaving these things in and learning to make meaning from our own wounds and stories.
Yeah, I feel for me, one of the biggest breakthroughs that I had in my years and years of therapy was when she helped me be able to hold both perspectives, let's say, both the anger and the excitement of that experience, right? Being able to hold both the good intentions that I had as well as the not so good intentions, and not make meaning that I'm a good person because I had the good intentions, but oh no, I just recognize that I had bad intentions. That means I'm a bad person. Right? So
Right.
being able to hold, I simultaneously am very jealous of her and happy for her.
Yeah.
And can I hold both without making it mean anything about who I am as an individual?
Yeah. And one of the things I often say is that within every piece of our personality, every personality trait we have, every, passion we have, etc., there is capacity for both shadow and light.
Mm-hmm.
So I can, for example, be a really confident person, and that can be the light in me that is strong and confident. And the shadow side of that is maybe that I have a tendency to get arrogant and to get cocky about how good I am at stuff. So I have to, walk that middle line of seeing, oh, this is light and shadow in me, and that's good, because the light and shadow balance each other and keep me humble. If I were all light, if I were all goodness, I would also, be really full of myself. And so to see my blind spots, to own that part of my, my shadow and who I am, is part of staying humble in the world, and staying and being able to be present for other people who have weakness as well, because every one of us is deeply flawed in some way.
Yeah, and I feel like, this is also part of that decolonization or dismantling of kind of our patriarchal white supremacist culture. That's the addiction to the light. That is addiction to only seeing the good. And it's called positive thinking, right? And it's seen as such a great thing to do. But what are we losing out on by not being grounded in what's here?
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff is just frankly spiritual bypassing in my mind. Like when we get addicted to positive thinking, all that. And I tend to write a lot about grief and trauma and really hard things. And not so much anymore, but I used to get pushback, people that would email me and say, you should be a more positive thinker. You're putting the stuff, you're putting the stuff in the world, and you're a person of influence. Wouldn't it be better if you influence them toward the light and positive? And I said, this is where we'll have to agree to disagree, and you can unsubscribe if you need to, because I'm not going there. It's not it. I don't see the value in only ever painting the positive picture, because it's going to short circuit the stuff we have to do, the journey we have to take, and if we can't talk about the hard stuff, we're not really ever going to heal the like you say, the colonizer in us.
Right. And obsessing over the light doesn't give us any tools for how to navigate the darkness.
Exactly.
And the darkness is inevitable, right? It's a part of life. So what are we really doing when we're not talking about how to navigate the hard stuff?
We're avoiding it. We're pretending it's not there. It's all a pretense to keep ourselves feeling like we're safe, feeling like we're good people, etc. And you're right. That's all elements of the colonizer in us. Like it's supremacy, white supremacy. All of that is about how do I seek perfection, and how do I squash imperfection? And so, we try to find the perfect race. We try to find the perfect gender. We try to find the strongest people. We try to elevate people that are, like Hitler, for example, trying to create purity in a race. this is all about being colonizers. And until we learn to let go of that perfection and learn to let go of these impossible and unhealthy ideals, we don't. And so that's where you see it, like, the women's empowerment movement that's all about curating our perfect, pretty lives, it's all buying into the patriarchy. Really is.
Yeah, yeah, I know that. I hear that. So let's talk about grief for a minute,
Mm-hmm.
because I know that this is something that so many of us navigate any given moment. Um, Tell me, what are some things that we can begin to understand or address when it comes to holding space for our own grief?
Mm. Again, it's still the same language, but I say, don't colonize yourself. Like, don't make yourself wrong. And that's one of the biggest things, is that we have this tendency to think, I'm doing this wrong. I'm too, I'm not getting over this. There's expectations that we have to get past it, that we have to be strong, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all false, false expectations. And so we have to learn self-compassion, to be kind to ourselves, to give ourselves the space. I mean, there's a reason it's called holding space, because it's about creating the spaciousness to really let these things emerge and surface. And there's so much of this. The more I learn about trauma, the more I learn that, for one thing, talking about this is never good enough. We have to go into our bodies to heal this stuff. We have to, my daughter had a close friend that in Canada here, we've just had this horrible tragedy where a hockey team crashed their bus and 15 kids, hockey players on this team, were killed. My daughter's friend was on the bus. He survived, but so the whole country is kind of dealing with this trauma and grief over 15 young guys killed instantly. Mm-hmm. And so I said to my daughter, I said, one of the things I said is, once they're in Saskatchewan, a different province than us, but once he gets home, and with his girlfriend, I said, I want to send you guys all to the spa. Like, I think a day just hanging out in the hot tub, hanging out and chatting and being together as a friend group and getting massages or something like that is going to be a good way for you guys to release some of this trauma that, from this experience, and healing some of that grief. So it's really about being present for it and recognizing the complexity of how grief affects us, instead of just seeing it as it's just sadness and you'll get over it. Well, no, it gets into our bodies, it gets into our relationships, it changes who we are, etc.
Yeah. So, if somebody comes to you, in a space of grief and wanting to grieve, what do you recommend that someone that is now expected or kind of wants to hold that space for that grief? How do you navigate that without, especially empathetic people, who feel everything? And this is something, I'm starting grad school for psychotherapy, and so many of my cohort members, they all say, I think that my greatest challenge is going to be that I'm so empathetic that I make it be about me. Right?
Yeah.
And that's, like you said, not really holding space, that's centering yourself. So how do we use our empathy to be with a person that is in grief without making it be about us?
Yeah. It's funny. I just had a conversation with a client about that this morning. It comes up a lot. And one of the things I teach is that, you have to have some kind of spiritual practices. And, I use that term spiritual loosely, but I teach about things like mindfulness. There has to be something, and I use mindfulness fairly broadly. It doesn't have to be sitting on the cushion kind of mindfulness, but learning to be present for what shows up and then releasing it without getting attached to it is part of the process of learning to release it. But having a way to process that is both spiritual, body-centered. And the other thing is, there's this really great diagram. I can't take credit for this, but there's an article online that I share quite often. It's about if somebody's in crisis, the layers of circles of that person in crisis. So the person in crisis is at the center circle. The people that are next affected are just outside that circle in a slightly larger circle, and it increases depending on how close you are to the person in crisis, so their family members and friends, et cetera, et cetera. And what this article says is essentially is that you offer comfort in and you dump out. So it's really simple: comfort in, dump out. So what we as people who hold space, we have to focus on, okay, so you're the person most affected by this narrative, whether it's a crisis, a trauma, or whatever. I'm going to withhold my emotional response to it for your sake, but then I have the right to dump out and look for somebody who's a little bit less attached to that crisis, who can hold space for me. So for example, with my daughter, whose friend was on the bus, her best friend is this guy's girlfriend. And my daughter is currently supporting the girlfriend. She says, I'm going to make her my focus because everybody's focusing on the guy who was on the bus, but who's looking after Jess? So she's looking after Jess. And I said to my daughter, I said, okay, you're offering her comfort, so your emotions may not be appropriate in that relationship. You can come to me to work through that stuff. So have someone, one step removed that becomes your container for it, so that you're not dumping it on the person that's impacted in that narrative.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I feel, that boundaries is also kind of critical here, right? Like knowing what's not yours, knowing when there's an energetic kind of block between someone's experience and emotions and yours.
Yeah. And that's why going back to the term I used earlier, I talk about emotional colonization, and that is that when we get too wrapped up in a story of somebody else's crisis and we feel so much compassion for them, we can be actually colonizing them and taking away their right to have a full expression of their grief.
Yeah.
And I think too, my mom was a person who was, I'll use her as a bad example, although my mom was a wonderful person, but she used to have this way of, if you were in grief, she'd bring all her grief to it too. And she would, feel badly for not supporting you better, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, then you ended up having to care for her. If I was at the center and I was being impacted and she was coming in and apologizing for not being a better support to me, then I had to turn around and try to comfort her because she was feeling badly, when I was the one that should have been at the center of that story, and I don't just say this blaming my mom, because I do the same thing. Sometimes I fall into those patterns too. But when we bring our stuff and become too affected by what's going on, then we make them become the caregiver, which isn't fair. So, it's not that we can't ever cry in front of clients or in front of people we care about, but when that becomes the center, that somebody has to care for us, then we're colonizing that situation and that narrative.
And that directly applies to anti-racial work.
Absolutely.
When a white woman, gets upset and gets teary because she realizes the violence that she has been perpetrating unconsciously, and that becomes overwhelming. So then she makes it be about her as opposed to the actual victim in the situation. And that can be really challenging because that continues to perpetuate the violence.
Exactly. And that's where those white women need to turn around and find somebody further out of the circle that they can, cry to. Or it's not that you're not entitled to your emotions, because you will have an emotional response to it, but do not turn those emotions at the people that are more impacted than you.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about holding space in complex conversations, such as the conversations of race. I know that so much of the same principles apply, but I would love to hear from your own words what that experience has been like for you in knowing about how to hold space in grief and trauma, and then, how it moves into this space.
Yeah, well, you can't, for one thing, you can't talk about race conversations without some understanding of trauma, because trauma is very much a weapon of the patriarchy. So marginalized people are by and large traumatized people. So one of the things that you have to do walking into these situations is have some understanding that these people very many of them have been traumatized by people that look like me.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I often say in my coaching work, I sometimes have people of color that come to me for coaching, for example, and I have to be clear with them that I'm very happy to work with you. And there may come a point in our relationship where I'm not the right person simply by virtue of the color of my skin, because you're going to have to work out some stuff about being oppressed by and traumatized by people who look like me, and that might not be a place where I'm the person who should hold space for you. So some of it is about being honest about simple limitations. That has nothing to do with my capacity to hold space. It's again about that person. What do they need in terms of being held in that center? On the other hand, if I have not been traumatized, sometimes I need to be willing to step into those situations because if they all have have trauma. I have a friend, for example, who works in a really difficult environment, in a family drop-in center in the center of our city where with the Indigenous people of our city, and it's such a traumatized culture because of residential schools, because children were taken from their families and thrown into residential schools or thrown into CFS, Child and Family Services, put into foster care situations, etc. That there is so much trauma there that they need some other people that are allies to help them hold the trauma, because it's hard for, it can be hard for them to do it for each other. So it's a balance of showing up and being willing to offer your gifts as an ally and offer what you can as an ally, but then knowing when it's time to step back and let them do the work themselves, and trying to find that balance, which it's tricky. It's not, I've made mistakes. There have been times when for example, I did some fairly tricky race relations conversations that I hosted here in the city a number of years ago. And I know walking away from that, there were times when I had a tendency to center myself, or I did things that weren't the right things to serve people. It's not perfect work. That's one of the things you have to know going in, is there's no perfect way to do this stuff.
Yeah. I attended a class called Feminist Theory, and we spent the entire day unpacking psychotherapy and mental health and how it perpetuates, patriarchy, white supremacy, cis heteronormative culture. And the room was comprised of all women and one man.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire class, I kept thinking about this one man and what it meant that he was in that space. And when he took up space, when he opened his mouth, when he shared something, I was constantly feeling like, this is great that he's speaking up, because it means he's interested, he's engaged. We need more men to understand this concept. And then the other side of me is, why is he speaking up? He shouldn't be speaking up. He shouldn't be taking up space. Like, he's a white man. He needs to be just quiet and listen.
Yeah.
Right? And so, it was in my head constantly, the entire class, thinking about him and what his presence represents. And so this is complex, even for us as the oppressed in patriarchy, right? And so when we add more identities such as race and class, it does get very confusing, and no one holds this answer, which is challenging for us because we want that answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, use that example. There probably is no right thing that guy could have done in that class.
Absolutely.
And that's important to remember, is that all of the people, if there's a dozen people in that class, there's 11 different experiences, female experiences walking into that room. And some people have been traumatized by guys that look like him. Some people, they have very different stories about what white men are. So some are going to have an experience of him as, oh my gosh, he's the kindest man around. Others are going to say, or have the experience of, why didn't he just shut up and let us have our space? And others are going to think he didn't even belong there, etc. So he is never going to have any way of being the right white guy in that room. So, and it's important to remember that walking into these complex spaces is that I, as a facilitator in some of these conversations, for example, I'm never going to be the right facilitator for every single person that's in that room, especially if there's, interracial stuff, there's trauma, etc.
Yeah, it's almost like holding space also means understanding the space that we take up.
That's very true.
And
Yeah.
that's critical, because how can we hold space for others if we don't know how much space that we take up?
Yeah, exactly. And that's sometimes the mistake that I make, is that I feel like I'm, as a facilitator, I have this need to hold the container. And then sometimes what I think of as holding the container is actually controlling the space.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it requires a lot of humility to try to, and self-forgiveness, because when you do make a mistake, you try to let yourself know, look, I screwed this up, and I may owe an explanation, or not an apology or whatever, to the people that I held space for, and I'm going to try again the next time,
Yeah.
because it's not I'm not here to be perfect. I'm here to make a difference and keep showing up.
Yeah. Yeah. Ah, this is so good. Any other final thoughts around holding space, or anything else that you want people to be sitting with as we wrap up the conversation?
Hmm. Yeah, right now, I think the thing that's really on my mind the most is, what does it mean to meet each other as sovereign people, and
Yeah.
what does it mean? And I don't think we know, and that I think we can explore the edges of this right now, but I don't think we have any lived experiences that teach us how to do this.
Yeah.
And so, because we don't, we're all on this exploratory journey together to figure out that if there were no patriarchy, no white supremacy, etc., and we could all meet each other as whole and sovereign people, what might that look like? And
Yeah.
so that feels like a quest for me, is like, if I can work through my own social conditioning and trust that you're working through yours, what does that mean to meet each other that way, and hold space for each other with that kind of lens? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot to learn on this journey.
Yeah, I talk about it in terms of autonomy. Yeah, and like
Hmm.
respecting the autonomy of others while also respecting my own. And that plays right into boundaries and
Yeah.
communication and relating to one another, empathy. I mean, this is such good, juicy work.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I um I don't love the language of boundaries, to be honest with you. I'm wrestling with some better language, and I've started to, in the post I wrote about claiming our sovereignty. One of the languages I've kind of adopted. I don't know fully adopted, but I was playing with on that in that article was, what if we in relationships. So I'm from Canada, where one of our big issues is the way we treat the original peoples of this land, the
Mm,
Indigenous people. And the issue there is that we have failed to live up to the treaties. We did sign treaties when settlers came to this land, but then we've, bulldozed over these treaties, etc. So what if instead of talking about boundaries, what if we start talking about the way we establish treaties in our relationships? So
mm,
what is, if we're in relationship together, instead of talking about boundaries, you can't cross this, what if we talk about, this is my request of how to be treated in this relationship. I'm establishing this as my part of the treaty. You put forward what you want in the treaty. So how do we come to that place of, it's like dancing.
mhm.
If we're going to do an intimate dance, like a tango or something like that, we have to understand, this is we can be in really close contact, but there's a space that is your body space, and I'm not going to step on your toes because I'm trying to dance with you. I'm going to try to find a way of moving together in a way that works for both of us, so that we can both shine in that.
Yeah, I
Does that
love
make
that.
sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. And the word that came up to me was this idea of a psychological contract,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
plays a big role as a coach, because there's the contract that we sign that outlines what our work together is going to look like, right?
Yeah.
But that's one boundary, but the boundary that actually really matters is the psychological contract that we unintentionally sign around how we're supposed to be showing up for each other.
Yeah.
And when that's violated, that can be devastating to the relationship.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so I think we need some better
I,
language
I agree.
around that in our relationships, of
Yeah.
how to be in, how to establish these contracts or treaties or agreements or something
Yeah.
in our relationships.
Yeah, this is definitely something for us to continue to percolate on and see what we come up with.
Hmm. Hmm.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your wisdom with us. I really appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. It's really been a pleasure.